The first
It's
thing I
okay.
saw after my
These are
stroke
just some
was my
forms for
son
the insurance
standing beside
company.
my hospital bed,
Everything is going to
holding
be
a
fine,
stack
I
of
promise.
papers and smiling like
It
everything was
won't
going to be
open.
all
What did you
right.
do?
3 weeks later, I came home to find my front door
I think you
unlocked by
know.
his key instead of mine.
We don't have to
Mom,
do
you
this
don't
right
need
now
to
if you're not
worry
ready.
anymore,
No.
Brian said.
I
The
need
house
to
is
know what
taken
he
care
wrote.
of. I couldn't speak properly yet. My right hand still trembled. I barely remembered signing anything in that hospital room. Then I noticed my husband's old file sitting on the dining table. One page had been folded behind the others for years. Brian had read every page he thought mattered, but he never looked at the name written on the back. Before I tell you what happened, I'd love to hear from you. If this story touches your heart, please like and subscribe. And if you've ever felt betrayed by someone you trusted, leave me a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Tonight, as I share my story, it would mean a great deal to know that I'm not sitting here alone. My name is Rachel Hill, and for 43 years, the little white house on Willow Creek Road was the center of my entire world. My husband Richard and I bought it in the spring of 1980. We were young then, with very little money and far more dreams than common sense. The house itself wasn't impressive. It had faded siding, a leaking roof, and floors that creaked every time someone crossed the hallway. But Richard stood in the front yard with his hands in his pockets and smiled at me. "This is where we'll grow old," he said, and somehow we did. Richard built the wooden porch himself during the summer of 1983. I still remember him standing shirtless in the North Carolina heat, wiping sweat from his forehead, while our son Brian chased fireflies across the lawn. Every nail in that porch carried his fingerprints. The maple tree in the backyard was planted the year Brian turned 5. The kitchen cabinets were painted together on our 20th anniversary. The blue bedroom upstairs became Brian's room, then a guest room, and eventually a storage room after he moved away. People often say a house is only wood and brick. They are wrong. A house remembers. After Richard died from heart failure 6 years ago, the silence inside those walls became almost unbearable. For months, I still woke up expecting to hear his footsteps in the hallway. Sometimes, I found myself setting out 2 coffee cups before realizing I only needed 1. Grief changes time. Some days felt endless. Others disappeared completely. At first, Brian visited often after his father died. He brought groceries. He fixed the garage door. He helped mow the lawn. I remember feeling grateful. I remember thinking Richard would be proud of the man our son had become. But slowly something changed. The visits became shorter. The phone calls became less frequent. Whenever Brian did come over, the conversations somehow drifted toward money. "Mom, you know this house is worth a fortune now. You could sell and live comfortably somewhere smaller. You don't need all these rooms." At first I laughed. "I need them because they're mine." He would smile and change the subject, but the subject always returned. Jessica, my daughter-in-law, never tried very hard to hide her feelings. She wasn't cruel in obvious ways. She preferred polite criticism. "Rachel, this place is getting difficult to maintain. You shouldn't be climbing stairs anymore. Large houses can become dangerous for older people." She said everything with a smile. A smile can sometimes hurt more than anger. There were moments when I felt as if they were discussing my future while I sat right in front of them. One Sunday afternoon, Jessica stood in my kitchen looking around the room while I prepared lunch. "This neighborhood has become very desirable," she said. Brian nodded. "The market is incredible right now." I placed the casserole dish onto the counter. "Well, that's nice for the neighborhood." Jessica laughed softly. "No, Rachel. I mean your house." I looked at Brian. He avoided my eyes. For the first time, I felt a small knot tighten in my stomach. Not fear, just discomfort, a feeling that something wasn't right. Fortunately, there was one person who still treated my home exactly the way Richard and I always had. My granddaughter, Lauren. Lauren was 21, studying education at the university in Asheville. She visited every Wednesday after classes. Sometimes she brought coffee, sometimes groceries, sometimes nothing except her company. She sat with me on the porch where Richard used to sit. She asked about my garden. She listened to stories she had already heard 20 times. Young people often rush through life. Lauren never did. One afternoon, while we planted tulips near the fence, she asked me quietly, "Grandma, are Dad and Mom bothering you about selling?" I tried to smile. "They worry too much." She looked down at the soil. "No, Dad talks about this house a lot." That surprised me. "How much?" Lauren hesitated. "I've heard them arguing about money." I stopped digging. "Money?" She nodded. "I think Dad lost money on something." I didn't ask further. A mother spends most of her life protecting her children, even after they become adults. We make excuses for them because the alternative is too painful. I told myself Brian was simply stressed. Middle age is difficult. Bills, careers, responsibilities. Maybe he just needed support. Several weeks later, Brian came by alone. That almost never happened. He sat across from me at the kitchen table where Richard and I had shared thousands of meals. He looked tired, older. His hair had started graying at the temples. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "What happens to the house eventually?" The question felt strange. I stirred my tea. "Eventually. You know, someday." I looked toward Richard's photograph sitting beside the window. "I haven't thought much about it." Brian leaned forward. "You should." I smiled gently. "I suppose." He lowered his voice. "Dad would have wanted the house to stay in the family." Something about those words unsettled me, because Richard had always said something different. He used to tell me, "The house belongs to whoever protects it." At the time, I never understood exactly what he meant. Brian stood and walked through the dining room. His eyes moved across the walls, across the furniture, across the old piano, almost as if he were seeing the house differently than I was, as if he wasn't looking at memories, as if he were measuring value. Before leaving, he stopped near the front door. "Mom." "Yes. If anything ever happened to you, I'd take care of everything." I smiled. "I know you would." At least I believed it then. That night, I sat alone on the porch. The autumn air had become cold. The maple tree Richard planted had lost most of its leaves. I could hear distant traffic from the highway and the sound of wind moving through the branches. Sometimes widows develop conversations with people who are no longer there. I looked at Richard's empty chair. "I hope we raised him right." The wind answered. Nothing more. I had no idea that within a few short months, I would wake up unable to speak. I had no idea that my own son would stand beside my hospital bed holding papers. And I certainly had no idea that the house Richard built with his own hands was already becoming something else in Brian's mind. Not a home, not a memory, not a promise. Just an asset. And somewhere hidden among old papers I had not touched for years, my husband had left behind something that neither Brian nor I fully understood. At least, not yet. The morning of my stroke began like every other morning. That is the strange thing about life-changing moments. They rarely announce themselves. There are no warning bells, no dramatic music, no feeling that your entire world is only minutes away from falling apart. It was a Tuesday in late October. The air outside had turned cold overnight, and the maple leaves Richard had planted decades earlier covered most of the backyard. I woke up just after 6, the same way I had for almost 40 years. Retirement never changed that habit. I made my bed. I fed the birds. I opened the kitchen curtains. The sun was only beginning to rise over the neighboring houses. Richard used to say that morning light made our kitchen look younger. Sometimes I still spoke to him. "Looks beautiful today," I whispered as I turned on the coffee maker. The silence answered me. I remember reaching for the coffee mug. I remember feeling suddenly dizzy. The room seemed to tilt slightly to the left. At first, I thought I had stood up too quickly. I sat down at the kitchen table and waited for the feeling to pass. Instead, it grew worse. The coffee cup slipped from my hand and shattered on the floor. I tried to stand. My right leg refused to cooperate. A strange numbness spread through my arm. Then I attempted to call for help. No sound came out. My mouth moved. My voice did not. Panic flooded through me. I had lived alone for 6 years since Richard died. In that moment, the house that had always protected me suddenly felt enormous and empty. I tried reaching for my phone. It fell from the table. I remember hitting the floor, the cold tile against my cheek, the ticking clock on the wall, and the overwhelming fear that I might die there alone. I don't know how long I lay there. 10 minutes, perhaps 30. Eventually, my neighbor Linda Grayson came by. Every Tuesday, she walked her dog past my house. When she noticed the front door slightly open, she became concerned. Later, she told me she heard a strange noise coming from the kitchen. She found me lying beside the broken coffee cup. The ambulance arrived quickly. The paramedics asked questions I could not answer. "Can you tell us your name? Can you squeeze my hand? Do you know what day it is?" I could understand every word. That was the terrifying part. My mind was awake. My body was betraying me. The emergency room felt like a blur of bright lights, voices, machines, and faces. Doctors moved quickly. Nurses inserted IV lines. Someone said the word stroke. Someone else mentioned timing. I remember looking at the ceiling and thinking only one thing. I need Brian. No matter how old we become, a mother still wants her child when she is frightened. The hospital called him. He arrived nearly an hour later. At first, seeing him made me feel relieved. He rushed into the room. He grabbed my hand. "Mom, I'm here." I wanted to cry. Instead, tears simply rolled down my face. The doctor explained that I had suffered a moderate stroke. Thankfully, it had been caught early. My speech was affected, and my right side had become weak, but there was hope for recovery. Brian listened carefully. He asked many questions. At first, I thought he was simply worried, but gradually, the questions began to change. How long before she can sign documents? Can she make financial decisions? Who becomes responsible during recovery? Can she live alone? The doctor looked slightly uncomfortable. "We'll evaluate that later." Brian nodded. "What if she isn't capable?" The doctor answered carefully. "That depends on her recovery." I wanted to tell him I was still there. I could hear every word. I understood everything, but my tongue felt trapped inside my own mouth. That afternoon, Jessica arrived. She stood beside my bed, holding flowers. She kissed my forehead. "You scared us." Her voice sounded kind. Her eyes seemed distant. Later, while they believed I was sleeping, they stepped outside the room. The door remained slightly open. Their voices drifted through the hallway. "She can't stay alone. She won't be able to manage the house. We need to figure this out. How much time do we have? I don't know." The last sentence came from Brian. "We may only get one chance." My heart began pounding. One chance for what I tried lifting my head. Pain shot through my neck. The machines beside me beeped faster. A nurse entered and asked me to relax, but I couldn't. Something felt wrong. Over the next 2 days, therapists came into my room. Speech therapy, physical therapy, occupational therapy. Everyone encouraged me. Everyone told me recovery would take time. Brian visited every morning. He brought coffee. He brought flowers. He smiled at the nurses. He thanked the doctors. Everyone called him a devoted son. One afternoon, I watched him standing beside the hospital window, speaking quietly on his phone. He did not know I was awake. I know. Pause. No, she can't understand much right now. Another pause. Yes, if this goes through, we'll be okay. He lowered his voice. The house is the only thing that can save us. My chest tightened. Save us? From what debt bills? I didn't know. He turned around and saw my eyes open. He smiled immediately. Mom, you're awake. I tried to ask him what he meant. The words would not come. He squeezed my hand. Don't worry about anything. I'll handle everything. Those words should have comforted me. Instead, they frightened me. 3 days later, Lauren came. I still remember her face. Her eyes were red from crying. She sat beside my bed and held my hand. Grandma, I'm so sorry. I squeezed her fingers. She smiled through tears. You're going to get better. Brian entered the room. His expression changed slightly. Lauren, Grandma needs rest. She looked surprised. I've only been here 10 minutes. She needs to avoid stress. Lauren glanced at me. I wanted her to stay. I couldn't say it. She kissed my forehead. I'll come back tomorrow. After she left the room, became quiet again. Too quiet. That evening, I noticed Brian studying some paperwork while sitting beside my bed. Several forms, several signatures, several highlighted sections. He quickly closed the folder when he saw me watching. Hospital paperwork, he said. I nodded weakly, but something inside me had begun to change. Fear. Not fear of the stroke, not fear of death. Fear that while I was struggling to speak again, someone else had already begun speaking for me. As darkness settled outside my hospital window, I looked toward the empty chair beside my bed. For the first time since Richard died, I wished desperately that he were there, because somehow, even before I understood what was happening, I knew my life was no longer entirely my own, and my son had started making decisions that I had never agreed to. The fourth morning in the hospital began with rain against the windows. I remember lying awake long before sunrise, listening to the steady sound of water hitting the glass. Hospitals have their own kind of silence. Machines breathe, shoes squeak along polished floors. Distant voices echo through hallways. You never truly sleep. You simply wait for morning. By then, my speech had improved slightly. I could form simple words, though each sentence felt like climbing a mountain. My right hand still shook whenever I tried to hold anything heavier than a spoon. The therapists seemed encouraged. The doctors were optimistic. Brian seemed relieved, or at least he pretended to be. That morning, he arrived carrying coffee and a brown leather folder. Good morning, Mom. I managed a weak smile. He sat beside my bed and helped adjust my pillows. Doctor says you're improving. I nodded. I'll go home. He hesitated. Eventually. Something in his expression made my stomach tighten. Over the previous days, I had started paying closer attention to him. Little things. How often he checked his phone. How quickly he changed subjects. How Jessica whispered to him in the hallway. How both of them became quiet whenever I opened my eyes. A nurse entered to check my blood pressure. After she left, Brian opened the leather folder. There are some forms we need to take care of. I frowned. What forms? He smiled. Nothing serious, just paperwork. I reached for my glasses. He handed them to me. Several pages were clipped together. The print looked blurry. My eyes still struggled to focus. I read a few words: medical, authorization, insurance, emergency contact. My head hurt. The letters seemed to move across the page. Brian pointed to several highlighted areas. Just sign where I've marked. I looked up. What is this? It's so I can help manage things while you recover. His voice remained calm. You don't need to worry about bills or appointments. I'll handle everything. A mother wants to trust her son, even when something feels wrong, especially when something feels wrong, because the alternative is too painful. I picked up the pen. My hand trembled badly. The signature looked nothing like my own. Brian gently placed his hand over mine. Take your time. I signed the first page, then the second, then another. Several times I stopped. Several times I tried reading. Each time he reassured me. It's standard paperwork. Everyone does this. The hospital recommended it. The words settled over me like a blanket, warm, comforting, and dangerous. Around noon, Jessica arrived. She was unusually cheerful. She brought flowers. She kissed my forehead. You look so much better. Then she glanced toward the folder. Did everything get signed? Brian nodded slightly. My eyes moved between them. Something passed silently between the two of them. Some understanding, some relief. I suddenly felt very tired. The speech therapist arrived later that afternoon. We practiced words, colors, months, family names. When she asked me to say my son's name, I looked toward the door. Brian. It came out weakly, but clear. She smiled. Excellent. After she left, Lauren came. This time, she entered before Brian arrived. The moment she sat beside me, I felt myself relax. She held my hand. Grandma, you're looking stronger. I smiled. She noticed the folder sitting on the table. What's that? I looked at it. Paper. What kind of papers? Before I could answer, Brian walked in. His expression changed immediately. Lauren. She stood. Dad? I thought we agreed Grandma needs rest. Lauren crossed her arms. I've been here 15 minutes. She's exhausted. I'm just visiting. Brian looked at me. Mom, you need quiet. I wanted Lauren to stay. I truly did. But speaking still required effort. Before I could respond, Jessica entered. Oh, good, everyone's here. Lauren looked uncomfortable. She kissed my cheek. I'll come tomorrow. After she left the room, felt smaller. Brian sat down beside me. Mom Lauren means well, but she gets emotional. I said nothing. She doesn't understand adult responsibilities. Adult responsibilities. The words stayed with me, as if caring for me had become some sort of burden. That evening, another man entered my room. He wore a dark suit. He carried a briefcase. At first, I assumed he worked for the hospital. Brian introduced him. This is Mr. Wallace. The man smiled. Pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Hill. His handshake felt cold. He placed several papers onto the table. I looked at Brian. What this? Just one last form. The man spoke gently. Only confirming that your son can assist with your affairs while you're recovering. I looked down. The page blurred. My head still hurt. The medication made me sleepy. I could hear rain outside. Machines beeped beside me. I suddenly felt overwhelmed. Later. Brian leaned forward. Mom, this really needs to be done. I shook my head slightly. Tired. He lowered his voice. If something happens, nobody can help you. The words frightened me. What if bills don't get paid? What if insurance stops? What if decisions have to be made? The suited man remained silent, watching, waiting. I wanted Richard. For the first time since entering the hospital, I nearly cried. Because Richard had always read every paper, every mortgage, every loan, every insurance policy. He used to joke, "Never sign anything when you're tired." But I was tired, exhausted, confused, and alone. Brian placed the pen into my hand. "Trust me." I looked into my son's eyes, the same eyes I had looked into when he was a baby, the same eyes I had seen on his first day of school, the same eyes that had cried when Richard died. How could a mother not trust her own son? I signed. The man collected the papers. He shook Brian's hand. Then he left. Something inside me felt unsettled. Not because I knew what I had signed, because I didn't. That night, I could not sleep. The rain had stopped. Moonlight entered through the hospital blinds. Brian had gone home. The room felt cold. I stared at the ceiling. Over and over, I replayed the afternoon. The man, the papers, the signatures, the pressure. I tried telling myself everything was normal, but my heart disagreed. Around midnight, I woke to voices outside my room. Jessica. Brian. "I told you she'd sign. We still need the other paperwork. Before she changes her mind. She's confused enough right now." Silence. Then Jessica spoke quietly. "Once this is done, we can finally breathe again." My chest tightened. I wanted to sit up. I wanted to shout. I wanted to ask, "Done with what?" But my body refused. The voices disappeared. The hallway became quiet again. I looked toward the empty chair beside my bed. Richard had always protected me, even when I never realized I needed protecting. For the first time, a terrible thought entered my mind. What if my son wasn't protecting me at all? What if he was protecting him that still sat beside the fireplace? Brian parked in the driveway. I looked toward the front door. Something immediately felt wrong. The brass lock had been replaced. I stared at it. "When did you change the lock?" Brian carried my overnight bag toward the porch. "A few days ago." "Why?" "For security." Security. The word felt strange. I had lived in that house for 43 years. No one had ever changed the locks without me. Jessica opened the front door. "Come inside, Rachel." The moment I entered, I stopped walking. The living room looked different. The lamp beside Richard's chair was gone. Several framed photographs had disappeared. The blanket I kept on the sofa had been folded away. The entire room felt unfamiliar. My eyes moved slowly across the walls. "What happened?" Jessica smiled. "We reorganized things." I looked toward Richard's recliner. It had been moved. No one had touched that chair since his funeral. Not even me. I suddenly felt breathless. "Why?" Brian placed his hand gently on my shoulder. "We needed more space." I needed to reassure myself. Needed to believe this was still my home. The dining room looked mostly the same. The kitchen had changed. Jessica had reorganized the cabinets. Several of my dishes had disappeared. The old cookie jar Richard bought me was gone. I opened a drawer. Empty. Another. Different utensils. My hands began shaking. I walked toward the hallway closet. Inside were several large boxes. Each box carried labels. Kitchen, bedroom, decorations. My decorations. My belongings. Packed. Stored. as if I had already left. I suddenly heard voices from the kitchen. Jessica, Brian. I told you she'd notice. She'll adjust. She can't manage this place anymore. I stepped into the doorway. Both of them became quiet. What am I adjusting to? Jessica forced a smile. We're only helping. I looked at Brian. My things are packed. He sighed. Mom, please don't make this harder. Harder. I felt tears burning behind my eyes. Harder for who? No one answered. That evening, Lauren came. The moment she entered, she stopped. What happened? She looked around the living room. Where's Grandpa's chair? Jessica spoke before I could. We moved some things. Lauren walked into the guest room. Her eyes widened. Grandma, why are you in here? I could not answer. Brian entered behind her. It's safer. Lauren looked at him. You moved Grandma out of her own bedroom. It's temporary. You took Grandpa's room. Jessica crossed her arms. We're staying here to help. Lauren looked at me. I saw something in her expression. Concern, fear, perhaps even anger. That night after dinner, I sat alone in my new room. I opened the drawer beside the bed. Inside was a stack of mail. Most of it addressed to me. One envelope had already been opened. County property records. I frowned. My hands shook as I pulled out the papers. The words were difficult to understand. Transfer, ownership, recording office, property. I heard footsteps. Brian entered. The moment he saw the paper, his face changed. Where did you get that? It was here. He took a deep breath. I was going to explain. My heart began pounding. Explain what? He sat down. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he spoke quietly. Mom, while you were in the hospital, we had to make some decisions. What decisions? You can't manage everything right now. I stared at him. The house. He nodded. My voice barely came out. What about the house? He rubbed his forehead. I've taken responsibility for it. I felt cold. I don't understand. You signed the paperwork. I shook my head. No, you did. I don't remember. He looked directly into my eyes. The house is legally protected now. Protected. Another word that no longer sounded kind. I stood slowly. Pain shot through my leg. Whose house? Brian's voice became quieter. Mom, legally, the house is now under my authority. The room became completely silent. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Somewhere in the house, the grandfather clock chimed. I looked at my son, the little boy I had carried, the teenager I had comforted, the man I had trusted. And for the first time in my life, I felt afraid of him. That night, I could not sleep. The guest room felt unfamiliar. The walls seemed too close. I could hear Brian and Jessica walking upstairs in my bedroom. Their footsteps crossed the floor where Richard once walked. Their voices drifted through the ceiling. My ceiling. My house. My memories. Near midnight, I left the room and slowly walked into the dining room. Moonlight entered through the windows. On the table sat one of Richard's old file boxes. Perhaps Brian had brought it down while cleaning. Perhaps he never noticed it. I touched the worn cardboard. Richard's handwriting still appeared across the side. Personal documents. I almost opened it, but I was exhausted. I simply rested my hand on the box, and for some reason I remembered something Richard once told me years earlier. If anything ever happens to me, don't throw away the papers. At the time, I laughed. Now those words returned to me like a whisper. Because somewhere inside that house, hidden among years of forgotten documents, Richard had left something behind. Something Brian had not seen. Something neither of us understood yet. And although I did not know it then, my husband had already begun protecting me long before my son ever tried to take my home. 3 days after I returned home, Brian announced that we were having a family dinner. He said it casually while pouring coffee into his travel mug. "A few people want to see you, Mom." I looked up from the kitchen table. "Who? Aunt Carol? Uncle Steve? Maybe a couple of cousins?" I frowned. "Why?" He smiled. "They've been worried." But something in his expression told me that worry had very little to do with it. The truth was that I was still recovering. Walking exhausted me. Speaking for long periods made my head ache. Some mornings, my right hand shook so badly that I struggled to button my own sweater. The idea of entertaining guests felt overwhelming. "I don't think I'm ready." Jessica looked up from her phone. "It'll be good for you." Brian nodded. "Everyone wants to see how you're doing." No one asked what I wanted. By late afternoon, cars began pulling into the driveway. The house that had once belonged to Richard and me suddenly felt like a place I had been invited to visit. Jessica prepared dinner in my kitchen. Brian moved chairs around the dining room. Neither asked my opinion. Neither asked where things belonged. I sat quietly in the living room while relatives arrived. Carol hugged me. "Oh, Rachel, you gave us quite a scare." Steve shook my hand. "You look good." I smiled politely. The entire evening felt strange. Everyone spoke softly around me. Everyone looked at me with sympathy, as though I had become fragile glass, as though I had suddenly turned into someone else. Lauren arrived shortly before dinner. The moment she entered, she came directly to me. "How are you feeling?" "Better." She looked around the room. Her eyes immediately noticed the changes. The missing photographs, the relocated furniture, the empty corner where Richard's chair had once stood. She said nothing, but I could see the concern in her face. Near midnight, I left the room and slowly walked into the dining room. Moonlight entered through the windows. On the table sat one of Richard's old file boxes. Perhaps Brian had brought it down while cleaning. Perhaps he never noticed it. I touched the worn cardboard. Richard's handwriting still appeared across the side. "Personal documents." I almost opened it, but I was exhausted. I simply rested my hand on the box. And for some reason, I remembered something Richard once told me years earlier. "If anything ever happens to me, don't throw away the papers." At the time, I laughed. Now those words returned to me like a whisper. Because somewhere inside that house, hidden among years of forgotten documents, Richard had left something behind. Something Brian had not seen. Something neither of us understood yet. And although I did not know it then, my husband had already begun protecting me long before my son ever tried to take my home. 3 days after I returned home, Brian announced that we were having a family dinner. He said it casually while pouring coffee into his travel mug. "A few people want to see you, Mom." I looked up from the kitchen table. "Who? Aunt Carol? Uncle Steve? Maybe a couple of cousins?" I frowned. "Why?" He smiled. "They've been worried." But something in his expression told me that worry had very little to do with it. The truth was that I was still recovering. Walking exhausted me. Speaking for long periods made my head ache. Some mornings, my right hand shook so badly that I struggled to button my own sweater. The idea of entertaining guests felt overwhelming. I don't think I'm ready. Jessica looked up from her phone. It'll be good for you. Brian nodded. Everyone wants to see how you're doing. No one asked what I wanted. By late afternoon, cars began pulling into the driveway. The house that had once belonged to Richard and me suddenly felt like a place I had been invited to visit. Jessica prepared dinner in my kitchen. Brian moved chairs around the dining room. Neither asked my opinion. Neither asked where things belonged. I sat quietly in the living room while relatives arrived. Carol hugged me. Oh, Rachel, you gave us quite a scare. Steve shook my hand. You look good. I smiled politely. The entire evening felt strange. Everyone spoke softly around me. Everyone looked at me with sympathy, as though I had become fragile glass, as though I had suddenly turned into someone else. Lauren arrived shortly before dinner. The moment she entered, she came directly to me. How are you feeling? Better. She looked around the room. Her eyes immediately noticed the changes, the missing photographs, the relocated furniture, the empty corner where Richard's chair had once stood. She said nothing, but I could see the concern in her face. Dinner began around 6. For years, I had hosted nearly every family gathering in this house. Thanksgiving, Christmas, birthdays, anniversaries. Richard always carved the turkey. I always served dessert. Now I sat at the far end of the table while Jessica occupied my usual seat. It sounds like a small thing, but it wasn't. Small changes often announce much larger ones. Everyone talked about ordinary things: weather, work, politics, grandchildren. For nearly an hour, the evening remained pleasant. Then Brian cleared his throat. I want to thank everyone for coming. The room became quiet. He looked around the table. As most of you know, Mom's stroke was serious. I lowered my eyes. The word serious sounded larger than the doctors had described. Brian continued. Recovery is going to take time. Carol nodded sympathetically. Of course. He folded his hands. And there have been some difficult decisions. I felt my stomach tighten. What decisions? He looked toward me. Mom can't really manage the house right now. The room fell silent. I looked up. The words came slowly. I can. Brian smiled gently. Mom, we talked about this. No, we hadn't. Not really. He turned back toward the family. With everything happening, Jessica and I have taken over most responsibilities. Jessica nodded. We only want what's best for Rachel. Something about hearing my own name spoken that way bothered me. Not Mom, not Rachel. Almost like a patient. Almost like a case. Steve spoke carefully. What exactly does that mean? Brian leaned back. I'm handling the property now. My heart skipped. Carol looked confused. The property? The house? Lauren immediately turned toward him. What do you mean? Brian sighed as though the explanation were obvious. Mom signed paperwork while she was in the hospital. I felt everyone looking at me. I swallowed. I don't remember. Jessica reached for her water glass. Rachel wasn't in a condition to manage everything. Lauren spoke again. Grandma's getting better. Brian's expression hardened slightly. This isn't about feelings. I looked down at my plate. For years, I had fed everyone sitting around that table. I had cooked their meals, babysat their children, opened my home for every holiday. Now I sat there feeling like a guest. Or worse, a burden. Carol spoke softly. So what's happening? Brian answered. I'm making sure the house is protected. Protected. Again that word. The same word he had used before. the same word that no longer felt safe. Lauren pushed her chair back slightly. Protected from who? The room became uncomfortable. Brian looked at her. Lauren. No, seriously. Her voice trembled. Protected from Grandma? Jessica intervened. Nobody is attacking Rachel. Lauren looked at me. Grandma, did you want this? My throat tightened. All eyes turned toward me. For several seconds, I couldn't speak, because I truly didn't know. I remembered hospital lights, medication, fatigue, papers, signatures, confusion, but I did not remember agreeing to surrender my home. I don't know. The words barely came out. Brian sighed loudly. Mom, we've talked about this. No. My voice became stronger. I don't remember. The silence that followed felt enormous. For the first time all evening, Brian lost his patience. You weren't capable of making decisions. The sentence hit me harder than I expected, because it wasn't about the house. It was about me, my intelligence, my independence, my dignity. I looked directly at my son. I am here. He rubbed his forehead. Mom, I am here. Nobody spoke. The clock in the dining room ticked loudly. Jessica finally broke the silence. Rachel, nobody wants to upset you. But I was upset. Not because of the house, because I realized that my own son had begun discussing my life as if I were no longer present, as if my stroke had erased me. Lauren stood up. Grandma's sitting right here. Brian looked angry now. Lauren, stay out of this. No. She looked at him. You're acting like she's gone. No one moved. No one spoke. Then Brian said something I will never forget. I'm the one taking responsibility now. Those words hung in the air. Responsibility, ownership, control. Perhaps they all meant the same thing. Steve finally changed the subject. People slowly resumed eating, but the evening had already changed. Everyone knew it. After dinner, relatives began leaving. Carol hugged me tightly. If you need anything, call me. Her voice sounded uncertain, as though she wasn't sure what was happening either. Lauren stayed behind. She helped me wash dishes. When we were alone, she whispered, Grandma, are you okay? I looked at the sink. No. Her eyes filled with tears. I don't trust Dad. The words shocked me, because daughters sometimes see truths that mothers refuse to see. I dried my hands. He's my son. She nodded sadly. I know. Then she said something that stayed with me. That doesn't mean he can't hurt you. Later that night, after everyone left, I walked slowly through the dark house. The dining room still smelled like coffee and roasted chicken. Empty glasses sat on the table. Voices still echoed inside my mind. You weren't capable. I'm taking responsibility. The house is protected. I entered the living room. Moonlight fell across the floor. Richard's old file box still sat beneath the table where I had left it. I bent down carefully. My fingers touched the worn cardboard. For some reason, I felt Richard close to me, as if he were standing beside me, as if he were telling me not to give up. And for the first time since the stroke, I realized something frightening. My son was no longer asking for my trust. He was expecting my surrender. And somewhere inside this house, among years of forgotten papers, there might still be something that belonged to me, something Brian had never found, something Richard had left behind. The morning after the family dinner, I woke up feeling older than I had ever felt in my life. Not because of the stroke, not because of my body, because something inside me had changed. For 70 years, I had believed that a mother always understood her child, even when others criticized him, even when mistakes were made, even when disappointment appeared. A mother keeps believing. But sitting at that dinner table and hearing Brian speak about me as though I were no longer capable had left a wound much deeper than illness. Outside my window, the maple leaves continued falling. Autumn had almost disappeared. Winter was coming. I slowly dressed myself and walked into the kitchen. Jessica was already there. She stood beside the coffee maker, scrolling through her phone. "Morning." "Morning." I opened the cabinet where I had kept my coffee cups for years. The shelf was empty. I looked around. "Where are my mugs?" "Oh, I moved them." "Where?" "The upper cabinet." I looked upward. The shelves were too high for me now. I stood there quietly. She noticed. "I figured it would look cleaner." Cleaner. Another small thing. Another piece of my life moved without asking. I climbed carefully onto the small step stool beside the refrigerator. My right leg still felt weak. My hand shook. Just as I reached for the mug, my balance shifted. The stool wobbled. I nearly fell. Jessica gasped. "Rachel!" She grabbed my arm. At that exact moment, Brian walked into the kitchen. His face changed instantly. "Mom, what are you doing?" "I wanted coffee. You could have asked." "I've made coffee in this kitchen for 40 years. His voice became firm. "That's exactly why you shouldn't be climbing." I sat down. My heart was racing. Brian poured my coffee himself. Then he sat across from me. "We need to talk." My stomach tightened. "About what?" "Your finances." I looked up. "What finances?" "The bills, insurance, bank accounts." I placed my cup down. "I can handle those." He shook his head. "No, Mom. Not right now. I've always handled them." "Things are different." The conversation felt familiar. Everything now was different. Everything now belonged to someone else. He pulled several envelopes from his briefcase. "I've redirected some of your mail." I stared at him. "You what?" "So nothing gets missed." "Why?" "Because you forget things." The words hit me like cold water. Forget things. I had suffered a stroke. I had not lost my mind. "I don't forget." His face softened slightly. "I'm trying to help." I looked toward the living room, toward the front windows, toward the house Richard and I built together. Suddenly, I felt like a visitor. That afternoon, I decided to walk outside. The air was cold. The garden had become neglected during my hospital stay. Dead flowers remained in the beds. Leaves covered the pathways. For years, gardening had helped me think. Richard used to joke that I spoke more to flowers than people. Perhaps he was right. As I stood beside the rose bushes, my neighbor Diane Foster appeared from next door. Diane and I had been friends for nearly 30 years. She had retired from a law office several years earlier. She carried a basket of muffins. "Rachel," she hugged me gently. "I've been worried sick." I smiled. "It's good to see you." She studied my face. "How are you really?" Nobody had asked me that. Not the doctors, not Brian, not Jessica, only Diane. And suddenly I wanted to cry. "I'm tired." She nodded. "May I come in?" We sat in the living room. She immediately noticed the missing furniture. "Where's Richard's chair?" I looked down. "They moved it." She frowned. "Why?" "I don't know." Her eyes moved slowly around the room. Diane had spent years working for attorneys. She noticed details, always. Eventually, she asked quietly, "Rachel, are you comfortable with what's happening?" I hesitated. The answer frightened me. "I don't know." "What do you mean?" I looked toward the stairs. Brian and Jessica were upstairs. I lowered my voice. "I signed papers." "What papers?" "I don't know." Diane became very still. "When in the hospital." "Did you read them?" I shook my head. "Could you understand them?" "No." She folded her hands. "What did Brian say they were?" "Medical papers." Diane remained silent. The silence itself worried me. She had spent 20 years around lawyers. She understood things I didn't. Finally, she spoke. "Rachel, do you have copies?" "No." "Any paperwork at all?" I thought for a moment. Then I remembered the envelope I had found. The county documents. I slowly stood. From my bedroom downstairs, I retrieved the papers. Diane read them carefully. The color slowly drained from her face. "What is it?" She looked up. "Where did you get this?" "It was in my drawer." She read it again. "This appears to involve property records." My chest tightened. "What does that mean?" She looked uncertain. "I'd need to see more." At that moment, Brian entered the room. His eyes immediately went to the papers. "What are those?" Diane answered calmly. "Rachel showed me some documents." His face changed. "They're private." Diane looked at him. "They concern your mother." Brian walked toward us. "I'll take those." Something inside me finally resisted. "No." The word surprised even me. Brian stopped. "What?" "No." The room became quiet. I held the papers tightly. "They're mine." He took a deep breath. "Mom, you're getting confused." "No." My voice shook. "I want them." Diane sat silently beside me, watching, listening. Brian looked uncomfortable. Perhaps for the first time since my stroke, someone else was witnessing these conversations. Someone who was not family. Someone who could see what was happening. That evening, after Diane left, she hugged me at the front door. "If you find any other papers, call me." "Why?" She hesitated. "Because something doesn't feel right." After dinner, Lauren came by. She brought soup and fresh bread. Brian barely spoke to her. Jessica stayed upstairs. Lauren sat beside me. "You look upset." I told her about Diane, about the paperwork, about the conversation. Lauren listened quietly. Then she said something that surprised me. "Grandpa kept everything." I looked at her. "What?" "The documents." I remembered. Richard had saved every paper, every insurance policy, every tax return, every deed. He trusted paperwork more than memory. "Where?" She smiled slightly. "Didn't he keep boxes somewhere?" I suddenly remembered the cardboard file box beneath the dining room table. Richard's handwriting, personal documents. My heart began beating faster. Perhaps because hope had finally appeared. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat alone in my downstairs room. I opened a small notebook I had found in my dresser. My hand still trembled. My writing looked uneven, but I wrote anyway. November 14th. Brian says I forget. I do not forget. Brian says he protects me. I do not understand. Papers, hospital, house. Trust nobody. The words looked shaky, but they were mine. For the first time since the stroke, I realized something important. If everyone believed I was confused, then my own memory might become my only witness. And somewhere inside this house, hidden among Richard's boxes, there might still be proof. Proof that I wasn't losing my mind. Proof that I hadn't given everything away. Proof that my husband had left me something more valuable than the house itself. The truth. The next morning, I woke up thinking about Richard. Not the day we married, not the day Brian was born, not even the day we buried him. I kept thinking about the boxes. Richard had saved everything: tax returns, insurance policies, old bank statements, instruction manuals for appliances we no longer owned. For years, I had teased him. "One day we'll drown in paper," he would laugh. "One day these papers might save us." At the time, I thought he was being ridiculous. Now I wasn't so sure. The house was unusually quiet that Wednesday morning. Brian had gone to work. Jessica had left shortly afterward. For the first time in weeks, I found myself alone, truly alone. I walked slowly toward the dining room. Richard's old cardboard box still sat beneath the side table. The faded handwriting on the side read, "Personal documents." My fingers trembled as I pulled it toward me. Dust covered the lid. The tape had become brittle with age. Inside were dozens of folders. Insurance, mortgage, vehicle titles, old tax returns, receipts from home repairs, even the original deed from 1980. I sat on the floor, surrounded by 40 years of our lives. For the first time since my stroke, I felt Richard close to me. Not in memory, not in grief, but somehow present, as though he had been waiting for me to open the box. An hour later, Lauren arrived. She immediately saw the papers spread across the floor. Her eyes widened. "Grandma," I smiled weakly. "I think your grandfather was a hoarder." She laughed for the first time in weeks. "He definitely was." She sat beside me. Together we began sorting the folders. Most of them contained nothing important: old warranties, expired insurance policies, canceled checks, receipts from furniture stores. But Richard had always organized everything carefully. Every folder carried dates, labels, notes. As the morning passed, hope slowly began fading. Perhaps Diane had been wrong. Perhaps there was nothing. Perhaps Brian truly had become the owner. The thought made my chest hurt. Around noon, Diane arrived carrying soup. She sat beside us. "Any luck?" I shook my head. "Nothing." Box over. A tiny key had been taped underneath. Richard, always prepared. I unlocked it. Inside sat several envelopes, a fountain pen, 2 old photographs, and 1 large manila folder. The front contained a handwritten note. "Rachel, only open if you truly need it." My eyes filled with tears. Richard's handwriting. After 6 years, I would have recognized it anywhere. The room became silent. Even Diane said nothing. I carefully opened the folder. Inside sat legal documents, typed pages, signatures, several stamps. At the top of one page, I read Hill Family Trust. I frowned. "What is this?" Diane leaned forward. "I don't know." Several pages discussed property, assets, successor trustees, medical incapacity. My heart began beating faster. Richard had never mentioned a trust, at least not that I remembered. Perhaps he had. Perhaps I simply wasn't paying attention. There were dozens of pages. Some appeared newer, others older. Then Lauren noticed something. "Grandma." She pointed toward the back. Several pages had become stuck together. The edges had yellowed, perhaps from age, perhaps from moisture. Carefully, she separated them. One additional page appeared, a final page, almost hidden, almost forgotten. Diane took a slow breath. "What is it?" She adjusted her glasses. Her eyes widened. For several seconds, she said nothing. My voice shook. "Diane." She looked at me. "I think you need an attorney." Fear spread through me. "What does it say?" She looked back at the document. "This appears to be an amendment." My throat tightened. "To what?" "The trust." I stared at the page. Legal language filled the paper. Difficult words, complicated paragraphs. Then I saw one sentence. In the event that Rachel Hill becomes medically incapacitated or is subjected to undue influence regarding the family residence, I stopped reading. My hands trembled. Diane continued. "The successor trustee shall immediately assume protective authority." My heart pounded. Successor trustee. The words meant nothing to me. Lauren leaned closer. "Who is it?" Diane slowly turned the page. At the bottom, one name, one signature, one person. Lauren Hill. The room became completely silent. Lauren looked stunned. "What?" I stared at her. "No." Diane read the page again. "It names Lauren as successor trustee." Lauren shook her head. "I don't understand." Neither did I. Why Lauren? Why not Brian? Why hadn't Richard told us? I suddenly remembered something. Years earlier, shortly after Brian had borrowed money from his father, Richard had spent several weeks meeting with an attorney. At the time, he told me, "I'm organizing things." I never asked further. Marriage creates trust. Sometimes, too much trust. Lauren looked frightened. "I don't want Grandma's house." Diane reached for the papers. "This isn't about ownership." "What is it?" "It's protection." The word struck me. Protection. The same word Brian had used, but suddenly it carried a different meaning. Richard hadn't been trying to control me. He had been trying to protect me. Protect me from what? Or perhaps from whom? Tears began sliding down my face, because one terrible possibility had finally entered my mind. Richard had worried about Brian, long before I ever had. Lauren sat beside me. "Grandma, I swear I didn't know." "I know." She took my hand. "I would never take your house." I squeezed her fingers. "I know." Diane stood up. "We need someone who understands trusts." "Who?" She thought for a moment. "There was an attorney Richard used years ago." "Who?" "Thomas Reed." The name sounded familiar. Richard had mentioned him several times. Old friend, retired attorney, trusted advisor, perhaps the only person still alive who understood these papers. Outside, snow had begun falling. The first snow of the season. Small flakes drifted across the backyard. The maple tree stood almost bare now. Winter had arrived. I looked at Richard's note again. "Only open if you truly need it." For 6 years, the box had remained hidden. 6 years. Waiting. And now, after my stroke, after the papers, after Brian claimed the house, Richard's secret had finally appeared. But there was still so much we didn't understand. Was the trust still valid? Did Brian know? Could the document stop him? And most importantly, why had my husband believed that one day I might need protection from my own son? As evening approached, I carefully placed the papers back inside the folder. Lauren sat beside me. Diane remained quiet. For the first time since my stroke, I felt something I had almost forgotten. Hope. Small. Fragile. But real. Because somewhere inside those pages was the truth. And on the final page that Brian had never seen was a name he never expected. Not his, Lauren's. And I had the terrible feeling that my husband had seen this future long before any of us did. I barely slept that night. The trust documents remained on my bedside table, and every time I opened my eyes, I looked at them again to make certain I had not imagined everything. Lauren Hill, successor trustee. My granddaughter's name sat there in black ink beneath Richard's signature. For 6 years, those papers had remained hidden. For 6 years, Brian had never found them. And now, after my stroke, after the hospital, after the signatures, and the arguments, and the locked bedroom, Richard's final protection had finally appeared. Yet none of us truly understood what it meant. The next morning, Diane arrived early. She carried 2 cups of coffee and a small notebook. I called Thomas Reed. I looked up Richard's old attorney, the man whose name I had not heard in years. What did he say? He wants to see the documents. Today? She nodded. He remembered Richard immediately. Lauren looked surprised. After all these years? Diane smiled. Some clients stay with you. Brian had already left for work and Jessica was visiting her sister for the afternoon. For the first time, the house felt almost peaceful. At noon, Diane drove Lauren and me across town. Thomas Reed lived in a small brick house near downtown Asheville. He had retired years earlier, but his office still occupied one room inside the home. Books lined every wall. File cabinets stood against the windows. The entire room smelled of paper and old wood. Thomas himself looked exactly as I remembered him. Tall, thin, white hair, kind eyes. When he saw me, his expression softened. Rachel. I nearly cried, because for the first time in weeks someone looked at me as Rachel. Not a patient, not a burden, not a problem. He held my hand. I'm very sorry about Richard. I nodded. So am I. He looked at the folder. May I? I handed him the documents. For nearly 30 minutes, nobody spoke. Thomas read every page, sometimes twice. Occasionally, he adjusted his glasses. Several times, he made notes. The room remained completely silent. Finally, he removed his glasses. When did you find these? Yesterday. He nodded slowly. I wondered if Richard's amendment would ever be needed. My heart skipped. You knew? Yes. Lauren looked confused. You helped him. Thomas nodded. Richard came to see me almost 8 years ago. I stared at him. Why? Thomas hesitated. Then he answered carefully. Because he was worried. Worried about what? He looked directly at me. Brian. The room became still, even though I had begun to suspect it. Hearing the words aloud hurt. Thomas continued. Your husband loved your son. Never doubt that. I know. But he also believed Brian sometimes made dangerous financial decisions. Lauren lowered her eyes. I remembered several arguments between Richard and Brian years earlier. Small things, loans, credit cards, business ventures. I had ignored them. Mothers often ignore what fathers notice. Thomas opened another folder. Richard established the Hill Family Trust to protect both of you. Why didn't he tell me he wanted to? Thomas smiled sadly. But he was afraid it would upset you. That sounded exactly like Richard. always protecting everyone's feelings, even when he shouldn't. Thomas pointed toward the amendment. This section is extremely important. He read aloud. In the event Rachel Hill becomes incapacitated or is subjected to undue influence concerning the family residence, the successor trustee shall assume authority for the protection of the property. I swallowed. What does that mean? It means that if someone pressures you into transferring the house while you're vulnerable, the trust can challenge those actions. Lauren looked stunned. Even if paperwork was signed, Thomas nodded. Possibly. My hands began trembling. Brian says I transferred the house. Thomas looked at me carefully. Did you knowingly transfer it? I don't know. Did you understand what you signed? No. Were you under medication? Yes. Were you recovering from a stroke? Yes. Thomas leaned back. Then there are serious questions. Serious questions. For the first time since my stroke, someone finally questioned what had happened instead of simply accepting it. I felt relief and heartbreak. Because if Thomas was right, then Brian had not simply made a mistake. He had taken advantage of me. The words felt impossible. Lauren spoke quietly. What happens now? Thomas folded his hands. First, we need copies of every document Brian had Rachel sign. Diane nodded. And if he refuses, we obtain them legally. I looked down. I don't want to fight my son. Thomas's voice became gentle. Rachel protecting yourself is not attacking your son. No one had said that to me before. For weeks, I had felt guilty. Guilty for questioning Brian. Guilty for doubting him. Guilty for being hurt. But perhaps I wasn't betraying my son. Perhaps I was simply protecting myself. Thomas opened another envelope. Inside sat an old handwritten letter. Richard's handwriting. My chest tightened. When did he write that? Shortly before his heart attack. I carefully unfolded the paper. My dearest Rachel, if you're reading this, then something has happened that I prayed never would. I trust our son with my heart, but not always with his judgment. Please remember that protecting yourself does not mean you love him less. The house belongs to you. It always belonged to you. And if one day you cannot stand up for yourself, I have asked someone who loves you without conditions to help. Trust kindness. Trust truth. Trust Lauren. And above all, trust yourself. Love always, Richard. The tears came immediately. I could barely breathe. Lauren wrapped her arm around me. For 6 years, Richard had been gone, and yet somehow he was speaking to me, guiding me, protecting me. Thomas waited quietly. When I finally looked up, he said, Richard knew you very well. I nodded. He knew me better than anyone. As we prepared to leave, Thomas became serious. Rachel, does Brian know about the trust? No. Good. Why? Because if he believes the house belongs to him, he may reveal things that become important later. I frowned. What things? Thomas answered carefully. His intentions. The drive home felt quiet. Snow covered the roads. Lauren sat beside me. Diane drove. Nobody spoke for several miles. Finally, Lauren whispered, Grandma, I'm sorry. I looked at her. For what? For being part of this. I squeezed her hand. You didn't choose this. But Grandpa did. I smiled through tears. Your grandfather trusted you. She looked out the window. I don't want the house. I know. The truth was that none of this had ever been about ownership. It was about protection, love, trust, and betrayal. That evening, when we returned home, Brian's car already sat in the driveway. He stood in the kitchen, waiting. His face looked tense. "Where were you?" I removed my coat. "Out." "Doing what?" For the first time since my stroke, I looked directly into my son's eyes without fear. Seeing an old friend. His eyes narrowed slightly. "What friend?" I paused, because something had changed inside me. Richard's letter, Thomas's words, the trust, the truth. I no longer felt completely helpless, and for the first time, I realized something important. My husband had not left me a house. He had left me a way to fight for it. Brian watched me carefully during dinner that evening. The old version of me would have noticed nothing. The old version of me trusted every smile, every explanation, every promise my son made. But something had changed. Perhaps it was Richard's letter. Perhaps it was Thomas Reed. Perhaps it was simply the moment a mother finally realizes that loving someone does not mean closing her eyes. Jessica served chicken and mashed potatoes. No one spoke much. The silence itself felt heavy. Finally, Brian looked up. "What friend?" I folded my napkin carefully. "Thomas Reed." For the first time in weeks, I saw genuine fear cross my son's face. His fork stopped moving. Jessica looked at him. "The attorney." I nodded. "He was your father's attorney?" Brian forced a smile. "Why would you see him?" "I had questions." He set down his fork. "What questions?" I looked directly at him. "About the papers." The room became silent. Jessica took a sip of water. Brian leaned back. "Mom, we've already discussed this." "No." My voice was calm. "We haven't." His jaw tightened. "I explained everything." "You explained very little." For several seconds, nobody spoke. Lauren sat quietly beside me. She understood immediately that something important had changed. For the first time since my stroke, I was no longer apologizing. Brian finally stood. "Can I speak with you privately?" I looked at him. "No." His eyes narrowed. "Mom." "If it's about my house, everyone can hear." Jessica shifted uncomfortably. Lauren lowered her eyes. Brian rubbed his forehead. "You don't understand these legal documents." I thought about Thomas, about Richard, about the trust. Perhaps I didn't understand everything, but I understood enough. "I understand that I signed papers while recovering from a stroke." His voice became sharper. "You needed help. Did I?" "Yes." "Or did you?" The question hung between us. Jessica immediately spoke. "Rachel, this isn't fair." I looked at her. "Was it fair to move into my bedroom?" She said nothing. Brian's face reddened. "You couldn't use the stairs." "I can now." "We were helping." I looked around the dining room, Richard's dining room, my dining room. And suddenly, I realized something. For weeks, Brian had controlled every conversation by making me feel guilty. Guilty for asking, guilty for doubting, guilty for being hurt. But the guilt no longer worked. After dinner, Brian followed me into the living room. His voice softened. Mom, why are you doing this? I turned. Doing what? Talking to attorneys. Because I want answers. He sat down. For a moment, he looked tired. Older. Almost frightened. You don't understand how much pressure I've been under. I remained quiet. The market collapsed. What market? My investments. I said nothing. He looked at the floor. I lost money. The words surprised me, although perhaps they shouldn't have. Lauren had mentioned debt months earlier. Thomas had hinted at financial problems. Now Brian finally admitted it. How much? He hesitated. A lot. My chest tightened. Why didn't you tell me? He laughed bitterly. What would I say that I'm 45 years old and failing? You're my son. Exactly. He looked at me. You've spent your whole life believing I would become successful. I felt tears rising. Success isn't money. He shook his head. It is when you owe people. The room became very quiet. For the first time, I saw not only my son, I saw a frightened man. A desperate man. A man drowning. But desperation does not excuse betrayal. I would have helped you. His eyes lifted. No. Yes. You would have given me money. And I didn't need money. His voice cracked. I needed everything to stop. Everything. Debt, failure, embarrassment, shame. And somewhere inside that desperation, he had looked at my house. Not as home, not as memory, not as his father's legacy, as rescue, as money, as survival. I never wanted to hurt you. The words almost broke my heart, because I believed him, at least partially. I believed he had not started with cruelty. I believed he had started with fear, but fear had become greed, and greed had become justification. I sat beside him. When you brought those papers into the hospital room, what were they? He didn't answer. Brian. His eyes filled with tears. I thought it would protect everyone. Protect who? He whispered, my family. I looked at him carefully. And what am I? He couldn't answer. Later that evening, after Brian went upstairs, Lauren sat beside me. Grandma. Yes. Do you think Dad loves you? The question hurt, because I knew the answer. When you brought those papers into the hospital room, what were they? He didn't answer. Brian. His eyes filled with tears. I thought it would protect everyone. Protect who? He whispered, my family. I looked at him carefully. And what am I? He couldn't answer. Later that evening, after Brian went upstairs, Lauren sat beside me. Grandma. Yes. Do you think Dad loves you? The question hurt, because I knew the answer. Yes. She looked surprised. After everything, I nodded. He loves me. Then why would he do this? I looked toward the staircase, because sometimes the people who love us convince themselves that hurting us is necessary. Because sometimes people become so afraid of losing everything that they stop seeing the people standing in front of them. And because sometimes love becomes mixed with entitlement. He thought the house would eventually become his. Lauren was quiet. And Grandpa knew that. I nodded slowly. That night, I opened Richard's letter again. One sentence refused to leave my mind. I trust our son with my heart, but not always with his judgment. Richard had understood something I never allowed myself to see. Brian was not evil. He was weak. And weakness mixed with money can become dangerous. The next afternoon, Diane called. I spoke with Thomas. What did he say? He found something else. My heart immediately began racing. What? He still has Richard's original file. I sat upright. The original. Everything. What does that mean? It means the trust is fully documented. I felt hope rising again, but Diane's voice changed. There's something else. What? Thomas says Richard added a private letter to the file. My throat tightened. A letter. Yes. To who? There was a long pause. To Brian. I couldn't speak. A letter Richard had written to our son, and Brian had apparently never seen it. That evening, I walked alone to the backyard. The first snow had melted. The maple tree stood dark against the evening sky. Richard had planted that tree when Brian was 5. Father and son, together. I remembered Brian running across the grass. I remembered Richard teaching him how to throw a baseball. I remembered Christmas mornings, birthday cakes, school graduations. The boy who once held my hand still existed somewhere inside the man who had taken my house. The question was whether either of us could still find him. As darkness settled around the yard, I suddenly heard Brian behind me. He stood on the porch. His hands were in his pockets, just like his father used to stand. Mom. I turned. What? He hesitated. Please don't let attorneys turn this into something ugly. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I answered honestly. Brian, I didn't bring attorneys into this house. He lowered his eyes, because we both knew the truth. The lawyers, the documents, the signatures, the trust, the hidden pages. All of it had started long before my stroke, long before my hospital room. Richard had seen danger years ago, and somewhere inside Thomas Reed's office sat another letter, one written by a father, one never delivered. One that might finally reveal why my husband had trusted our granddaughter more than our own son. I did not tell Brian about the letter. Not Richard's letter to me. Not the trust. And certainly not the letter waiting for him inside Thomas Reed's office. For the first time in my life, I was keeping something from my son. The realization hurt. Mothers are trained to share, to explain, to forgive, to protect. But Richard had spent years preparing for this moment, and I finally understood why he had remained silent. Sometimes truth needs time. 2 days later, Thomas called. I think it's time. I sat quietly in my downstairs room. Time for what? To read Brian's letter. I closed my eyes. Should he be there? Thomas hesitated. That's your decision. I looked out the window. Brian was in the driveway washing his car, the same way Richard used to wash his every Saturday. The same careful movements, the same folded sleeves, the same face. How could two people look so similar and become so different? I want him there. Thomas was quiet for a moment. All right. The meeting was arranged for Friday afternoon. No one slept much the night before. Lauren stayed with me. Diane came early. Even Jessica seemed nervous. Only Brian appeared irritated. I don't understand why we're doing this, I answered softly. Because your father asked us to. That silenced him. Thomas's office looked exactly the same. The same books, the same desk, the same smell of paper and wood. Richard had sat in this room many times. Now his family sat in the same chairs. Thomas placed a sealed envelope onto the desk. The paper had yellowed. Brian stared at it. "What is that?" Thomas answered quietly. "A letter from your father." Brian looked stunned. "To me?" "Yes. Several months before he died." Brian swallowed. "Why didn't I get it?" Thomas looked at him carefully. "Because Richard instructed me to deliver it only if certain circumstances occurred." The room became very quiet. Brian looked at me. I said nothing. Thomas handed him the envelope. His hands trembled. For several seconds, he simply stared at his father's handwriting. Then he opened it. His eyes began reading. No one spoke. No one moved. I watched my son's face slowly change. Confusion, surprise, pain, shame. Halfway through, his breathing changed. Near the end, tears appeared. When he finally lowered the paper, the room remained silent. Thomas looked at him. "Would you like to read it aloud?" Brian shook his head. "No." His voice barely came out. Lauren reached toward him. He pulled away. I wanted to ask what Richard had written, but I already knew. Richard always spoke gently, always honestly, always directly. Finally, Brian spoke. "He knew." Thomas nodded. "Yes." Brian looked at him. "He knew everything." Thomas folded his hands. "Richard was very observant." Brian stood up. "He thought I would steal from my own mother." "No." Thomas's voice remained calm. "He thought you might become desperate." The words settled heavily into the room. Desperate. Brian turned toward me. Tears filled his eyes. "Mom." But no words came. For years, I had imagined many conversations with my son. None looked like this. Thomas finally spoke. "Brian, your father asked me to tell you something personally if this day ever came." Brian looked up. Thomas continued. "Richard said that good men do not become bad overnight. They become afraid. And if fear controls them long enough, they begin convincing themselves that wrongdoing is love." Nobody spoke, because Richard was describing exactly what had happened. Brian sat down slowly. His shoulders began shaking. "I lost everything." For the first time, he told us the truth. The entire truth. 3 years earlier, he had invested heavily in commercial real estate. The market had collapsed. Loans accumulated. Credit cards increased. Additional investments failed. He borrowed money, refinanced debts, sold retirement accounts. Eventually, he owed more than he could repay. Jessica knew. No one else did. Not me. Not Lauren. Not Richard. At least not completely. He found out. Brian looked at the floor. Dad found the statements. I suddenly remembered the arguments, the late-night conversations, the tension between father and son. Richard had known. "He offered to help." Brian's voice cracked. "I refused." "Why?" "Because I was ashamed." The room remained quiet. Thomas looked at him. "And after Rachel's stroke." Brian closed his eyes. "I saw the house. Not my mother, not my suffering, not my recovery. The house." The sentence broke my heart, because he finally said it aloud. I told myself it would eventually belong to me anyway. Lauren quietly cried. Jessica lowered her eyes. Brian continued. I thought I was protecting my family. He looked at me. I convinced myself that you would understand later. I felt tears running down my face because I finally understood something. My son had not planned this for years. He had simply reached a point where fear became stronger than conscience. And once people cross that line, they often tell themselves stories. Stories that make betrayal feel reasonable. Thomas opened another folder. Rachel! I looked up. These documents strongly suggest that the transfer may not be legally valid. Brian looked at him. What does that mean? It means your mother may still fully control the property. The room became silent again. No one seemed surprised. Not even Brian. Because perhaps we all already knew. Perhaps deep down, he had always known. He looked at me. What happens now? I did not answer immediately, because mothers spend their lives preparing answers. But sometimes there are none. Finally, I said, I don't know. And that was the truth. I didn't know whether to forgive him. I didn't know whether to fight him. I didn't know whether the house would remain mine. I only knew that my husband had seen this day years earlier. Richard had not tried to punish his son. He had tried to save him, and perhaps save me too. As everyone prepared to leave, Brian remained sitting. The letter still rested in his hands. He looked smaller somehow, older, more like the frightened boy I once comforted after nightmares. When everyone stepped outside, he stopped me. Mom! I turned. What? He handed me the letter. I think you should read it. I looked down at the pages, Richard's handwriting, Richard's final words to our son. Are you sure? Brian nodded. Tears rolled down his face. He was right. My heart broke hearing those words. Because no child wants to admit that a parent saw their worst future, and no mother wants to hear her son say it. As we walked toward the parking lot, snow began falling again. Small flakes drifted through the cold afternoon air. Brian stood alone beside his car. For the first time in months, he looked directly at me. Not as a debtor, not as an heir, not as a frightened man, simply as my son. Mom. Yes. I'm sorry. The words were quiet, fragile, and perhaps long overdue. But apologies, like broken trust, need time. And I still had not read Richard's final letter. The appointment with Thomas Reed was scheduled for Monday morning. For the first time since my stroke, all of us traveled together. Brian drove. I wasn't certain where home was anymore. Thomas greeted us quietly. He seemed to understand that this meeting would change our family one way or another. We sat around the conference table. The trust documents lay neatly arranged. The hospital paperwork sat beside them. Thomas folded his hands. I've completed my review. Nobody moved. The transfer documents signed during Rachel's hospitalization raised significant concerns. Brian lowered his eyes. Thomas continued. Rachel had recently suffered a stroke. He looked at me. She was medicated. He looked toward Brian. She appears not to have fully understood the documents. He paused. And the trust specifically anticipated this type of situation. Jessica whispered, Oh God. Thomas opened another folder. The property remains inside the Hill Family Trust. My heart began racing. He looked directly at me. Rachel, the house still belongs to you. Silence. Complete silence. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Brian sat motionless. Jessica began crying quietly. Lauren reached for my hand, and I simply closed my eyes. because for the first time in months, I felt my husband standing beside me. Not physically, the young man who carried his father's casket, and now the middle-aged man drowning in debt. I spoke quietly. I don't want to destroy my son. Brian immediately began crying. Jessica covered her mouth. Thomas nodded. That is your decision. I turned toward Brian. Look at me. He slowly lifted his head. Did you know what you were doing? His voice trembled. Yes. The honesty hurt. Did you know I didn't understand those papers? He nodded. Yes. Tears rolled down my face.